So the quiz on Wednesday this is the quiz right here. You might be able to see it on when you go to the Moodle site, but you can't enter it yet. You shouldn't be able to enter it yet because it's not set to open for you until tomorrow morning at 8:30. And you can basically at 20 minutes from the point when you open it. I'm enlarging the time for your convenience, but also because I don't really know. I don't have good feedback yet from the IT department as to whether there will be a problem if all of you open it at the same time. So we will find out. Hopefully it'll be okay. I have even some classes bigger than this that how the system responds may determine what we can do in the future. But also in order to make, to at least minimize the opportunity to cheat, not that any of you would ever think about that, but in order to minimize it, that's why I have to have it in a fairly constricted period of time and constrict the time that you have to answer the questions, which makes it harder in some of you, makes it harder in all of you, but some of you more than others, which I regret, but nonetheless, that's one of the challenges of trying to give quizzes and exams on the internet, is how do we control it to some degree. Moodle helps us a little bit. It, for example, will mix up the questions, it'll mix up the answers within the questions. So even if two of you were sitting side by side, you'd have problems finishing this quiz in time trying to help each other because you won't see the same questions at the same time. You won't see the answers the same. They'll be mixed up. So A for one would be C for somebody else or whatever. So that makes it very difficult to try to cheat, and you'd end up wasting time trying to do that. So hopefully you'll have enough time, and if you studied, I would suggest, like many people do in Minitest, is give your first impression. Answer it and go on, answer it and go on, answer it and go on. Usually your first impression is correct. And you usually get yourself in trouble in a time test by kind of doubting yourself. And so you can go all the way through. It will allow you to go all the way through and still not say you're done. So then you can go back and look at the questions that you weren't sure about. And then you can question yourself because it is programmed to shut at when your time runs out, it closes. And so at that minute, you can't say, wait a second. It doesn't work that way. The computer is going to have no mercy on you. And so you should make sure you have all answers to all the questions. And like I said, your first impression, your first response is usually the correct one. And it's usually we talk ourselves out of the correct one by thinking, but maybe he's trying to trick me. Well, I'm not going to try to trick you, but that doesn't mean they're all, it doesn't mean they're not, in some cases, a little bit harder than, some questions are harder than others. And even myself, when I was previewing my own exam, I had to make sure that I was answering the question, like as I mentioned to you before, sometimes I phrase the question, which of the following is not true? And sometimes it's which of the questions is true? And so you have to keep in mind, what am I looking for here? Is it not true or is it true? So I had to, in previewing my own questions, had to keep reminding myself, okay, this one I'm looking for the one that's not true, and so forth. And I guess sometimes in phrasing that, it may seem a little tricky, but well, hopefully, if you've done your homework, okay, you'll be okay. But we're going to go through some of the questions, or some maybe not exactly the questions. I'm not going to take you through the quiz. I'm not going to do that. But I am going to go through some of the PowerPoints that you all created. If you who are presenting questions or presenting in the future will make sure you give us questions, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a weekly quiz, and so that you can see the questions in advance. And I may change them a little bit for the larger one, but the weekly quiz, as I've kind of given you a warning of already will be worth less than 1/2 of a point, as long as we have enough of them, or thereabouts. It'll be the entire quiz, and no matter how many questions it has, will be worth about 1/2 of a point, 1/2 of a percentage, and that will go into your percentage or your participation grade, that you're paying attention and so forth. And so rather than asking you questions like I started to do at the beginning of the semester, and that makes some of you feel kind of uneasy to be standing up there and everybody's looking at you, we'll get your participation grades through these weekly quizzes that are worth almost nothing, but will help prepare you for the larger quizzes, and we'll also see that you're paying attention and so forth. So this time, the first two groups didn't give me questions in the right format, and so I couldn't give you quizzes right away. The last one, I still didn't do it, partly because I had some questions of my own about why Poe gave certain answers, and I also, as I went back through, I ended up changing some of the questions of the team 3 also, that they weren't quite right either, as I went in and analyzed Poe's perspective on this. So that's another thing I want to do today, is go through Poe's various characteristics of different media, because the entire book is based on that. And so I want to, and so I've emphasized that a little bit in the quiz, and I'm going to emphasize a little bit today as we talk about it, just because it is so complicated and kind of weird, some of the ways he analyzes things. So I want to make sure we're all understanding it, because all the future presentations from the Poe book depend on it, in essence. Our ability to understand it and your ability to present it are both dependent on you understanding Poe's definitions of terms and how he sees it. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Some of you also have emailed me with questions about writing the complete lead. So I want to go through the complete lead and review again how that should be written. So we will do that today too. So our time today will be pretty much filled up, I think, with those sorts of reviews, and but they're important. Again, they're important not just for this, to prepare for Wednesday's quiz. In most cases, they're really important ongoing for the entire class. If you don't know how to write a complete lead, you don't know how to write a news story. And that's one of your very quickly upcoming assignments, is to write your first news story about what has happened so far during the semester. So the assignment to write the complete lead as one of your, there's 18 questions, I think, on this exam, or this quiz, is just to get you started in thinking about how to write in a new style, and make sure that because if you don't start off right, if you don't write the complete lead right, again, the complete lead are typically the first 2 paragraphs. It is possible, theoretically, for a complete lead to go longer. I think in my textbook I give an example of an 8-paragraph complete lead, but that's unusual. That's a very descriptive lead or something like that, maybe it starts with an anecdote of some sort, telling the story of a specific family, whereas the real story is about the economic recession or something. And so you start off with an anecdote, and in essence, that entire anecdote is part of your lead. Well, that's unusual. That's not a real common thing to do. It's a good way to start a complicated story about economics or something, but it's not common. So while it's possible to have an 8-paragraph complete lead, certainly in this class, I don't expect more than a 2-paragraph complete lead, and that's what I would say is the standard of most newspapers. Let me also add that that's not always, that the idea of a complete lead is not universal. It came from one of the most popular American journalism textbooks, and I adopted it in my textbook, and I thoroughly believe it's right. It's the best way to write, and I've been very successful in my career by adopting that method. In writing my textbook, I went through lots of other textbooks and read reviewed how they proposed writing leads and so forth. But this one made a lot of sense to me. Because what you find with a lot of even professional journalists today, you will find that many of them are trying to cram all the 5 W's into the lead. And that to me is the old style. Although it's still not that uncommon, when I call it the old style, it's still not that uncommon today. And when they do that, they push their leads to longer than 35 words. So they're long, they're complicated, and what this other author proposed and I adopted was just break it in half. You don't need all of the 5 W's in the first paragraph. Put some of them in the second paragraph. And that is much more pragmatic. It may be different than the traditional lead, but it is better because it shortens the sentences, shortens the paragraphs, and it gets to the same end. You end up having a 5W, who, what, when, where, why, how summary of the story before you start writing the body of the story. You just do it in 2 paragraphs instead of 1 paragraph, and it's better that way. So you may find examples in some of the top newspapers that conflict with this theory because it was one popular textbook author's perspective that I've adopted, and I do strongly believe it's best practices from my many years of professional activity. So that's what I teach. So I shouldn't teach not the best practices, right? So I want to teach you the best practices, and that I'm absolutely convinced is the best practice, or I wouldn't have adopted it myself. Okay, so anyway, this is the Moodle site. This is what you will see, and you will just click on quarterly quiz, and it will take you into the quiz as of tomorrow morning, or rather Wednesday morning at 8:30. You can go into it, and when you get into it, I say 20 minutes. I actually gave you 21, but remember, it's going to turn off. It's going to close it and steal it from you as soon as it gets to 21 minutes. So I gave you that extra minute, but be aware of what's going to happen. That's why I gave you the extra minute. Was if you're a little bit confused by something with this first quiz, as you're getting into it, now it will warn you when you click on that. It will say, now you have 20 minutes as soon as you click on this button. Are you sure you're ready to go? And so it warns you before you start that your timer will start as soon as you click on that next button. But nonetheless, because you haven't, perhaps, I don't know, maybe you have done Moodle quizzes before, but I want to make sure that those who have not taken a quiz in Moodle have that extra minute to kind of adjust to the environment that you're doing this in. If you have any problems, as soon as you have the problem, email me. I want to know what problems you have. Hopefully nobody will have a problem. But I want it documented so I can take it to IT. If we have any problems at all, I want it documented, and I want it documented as soon as you face the problem. As soon as you have the problem, tell me exactly what problem happened, what happened. You might even do a screen capture and send a graphic with it so I can see what happened. And IT can see what happened, and we can make sure it works in the future. I don't know that there's going to be a problem. I don't hope there's not going to be a problem. But I know we use Moodle at my previous university. I've never had a problem myself, but I did have a colleague at KeyMap University that had a large class, had over 100 students, and she was trying to have them do them at exactly the same time. She reserved computer labs. We had a bunch of computer labs around the university, and so she booked 3 computer labs, one right next to the other, at exactly the same time, and had the students start at exactly the same time. And that for that system, in Kazakhstan, it did not work very well. So I talked to IT already about it. They think it will be okay here. It depends a lot on the servers. I mean, it's not, it's the same software, but it's not the same server. So the server is really the key to how this system works. If the server is working okay, then it can handle all of you at more or less at the same time. Again, you won't all be opening at exactly the same time. So I would suggest some of you do try to get on it right at 8:30. And some of you purposely wait. We won't start class on Wednesday until 9:15, or 9:20, whatever it is, 9:20, I guess. And so you could wait and start at 10 minutes till or something if you're all ready to go. So as soon as you're done, you can run to class. And so that I don't know who's gonna do what. I'm not gonna try to assign you to when you start, because you'll be getting up anyway, and some of you'll be kind of lazy and pushing your alarm. I don't want to get up yet. And so it's, even if I tried to assign you, it probably wouldn't be perfect. But my guess is that if some of you get on right at 8:30 before other people, that you will have an advantage. And that you're more likely to get through without any problems whatsoever. And so I would suggest that some of you do that. Okay. Any questions on what we're trying to do here? I forgot to reprint our attendance sheet. So what I want you to do is go ahead on this last margin, just go ahead and initial it, and then on the back sign your name. So we kind of have a dual, that'll be your class 8. Okay, well, I left some of these, I was looking at them last night as I was finishing the making up the quiz, and so I'm just going to go ahead and go through some of these, including my own, to clarify some of the things that I may have said or done. I'm going to, I think I'm going to go ahead and leave it in this mode. You won't be able to see the slides quite as well. Let me, maybe I can bring it up just a little bit though. Maybe not that much. Bring it up as high as I can. And still, let me turn this off. Get that out of the way. Okay, that pretty much covers it, and that way you can see more of it, and I can see over here what I wanted to show you. I recolorized some of this to get specifically to the slides I wanted to get to. Some of you got, but at least arrived a little bit later than others. You weren't here the first week. And some of you, I think, actually didn't get here even the second week. And so you're playing catch up a little bit, and there's not a lot, I can't hold a class for you. I had to go on. We did not watch, I talked some about Clay Shirky's video. And there's several slides in this PowerPoint that is on Moodle, but we did not watch it in class. I would suggest that you should watch it in class, because not only is he a good speaker, but he covers a lot of things we're talking about during this semester. But you can count on something about his video being on the quiz. So it really wasn't this specific slide that I was going to take it from, but there are several slides here. For some reason, some aren't showing up. I don't know why, but it doesn't probably really matter. But there are several slides there based on Shirky, and you should be familiar with his video and understand that I consider it very important, not just for this exam, but for future discussion. You should also be aware, and I'm not sure why these are not. The graphics were all showing up last night. I don't know why they're not showing up now. Let me see what happens when I do project it, if it changes it at all. It does not. That's odd. Okay, well, this one, I had a couple of slides here, and they should be okay. In fact, maybe I will, well, I marked these, so I don't want to. Go back here again. This should show up correctly if you look at it on Moodle. Well, this is the one that had kind of, it's the opposite of this one here. This was a picture of the White House, and it was talking about modern communications. And this one just had a picture showing kind of the White House, suggesting that's the source of the information, with an arrow pointing out to people out on the outside, the audience, so to speak. That, in essence, was the old style. That was the 20th century media landscape, is that most of the media was owned by corporations, big corporations. We mentioned that there are 6 big corporations that control about 90% of all the American, top American media. And they exerted a lot of influence. They still are trying to, but actually the success of Donald Trump has demonstrated that they're failing, because almost all the media tried to stop Trump from becoming president of the United States, and they failed. And so that is an indication of that he is the social media president. The first real, I would argue that Obama was also, a lot of his was social media. So I don't know, there some so-called experts claim that Obama was the first internet president and Trump is the first social media president. I'm not so sure about that, but that's what some of them are saying. But regardless, they're both have adapted to the 21st century. And what is clear is that the media that controlled most of the news outlets in America in the 20th century have lost a lot of power. As I've mentioned before, I believe that WikiLeaks was the most powerful news medium in America during the last part of the election. And it's illegal. I mean, its news is based on hacking people's computers. And he's wanted, he would be imprisoned by multiple different governments if they could catch him. So that makes it rather unique that an outlaw is the source of the most trusted information, or was the source of the most trusted information during this last election. And most of it was focused on Hillary and the Democrats. And while they kept complaining, well, he stole that information, you can't trust him, they never denied anything that WikiLeaks said, to my knowledge. I don't recall them denying one word that WikiLeaks leaked, so to speak. So that's why they were so trusted. And also one reason, by the way, why the media right now in going after Donald Trump is not just going after Donald Trump. They're also going after WikiLeaks. They're trying to save their position in the American media landscape. And they're scared to death because one thing that WikiLeaks demonstrated was that they were not reliable sources. And of course, Donald Trump is proclaiming consistently that they're not reliable sources. They're hurting him, but he's also hurting them. And that's a phenomenon that will have long-range impact on American society going forward. The degree to which people feel like they can trust the media, the degree to which they feel like they can trust the president. If they can't trust either one, that becomes a rather weak society or governmental system. So it's, sorry to turn this on. So this is why, one reason why I'm saying this is such an important issue, and why Shirky's video is important to understand, even though his kind of stops at a certain point. His is about almost, I think it's 2009 when he did his video. So it's getting, it's 8 years old or something. And a lot has happened in the last 8 years to actually make it more true than it was before, than in 2009. In 2012 was when mobile really took off. 2012 was a pivotal year in the growth of the online media. And a lot of you you may not remember how dramatically things changed just 5 years ago, but they did dramatically change 5 years ago. For example, 5 years ago, there were 550% more videos viewed than the year before. In that 1 year, the video viewing increased by 550% in 2012. That by itself was a revolution in our society. Is that suddenly our capacity, our bandwidth overall, our servers were able to handle video better. Suddenly people were using broadband on their mobile devices, and mobile devices were growing, the use of them were growing very rapidly with smartphones, and suddenly people were watching videos on their smartphones that they couldn't watch with their dumb phones. Even though they were mobile, they were dumb, so to speak. And so that transition to the smartphone changed everything too. So lots of things happened in 2012, just 5 years ago, that changed the media landscape and made it more social, more mobile than it was before that, and also helped lead to Trump's victory, for example. So this is, you see the words, you don't see the graphic, but it's basically saying that landscape with the dominance of the mainstream media, the traditional media, made media local or regional and at best national. Most newspapers in America are local or regional. There are a few like the Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal that would be considered national newspapers, and to some degree international newspapers. But there are not very many newspapers in America would be at all described as being international. As opposed to, the next slide, most media, the dominant media today have a presence on the internet which makes them global. By the very definition, once you go on the internet, you are now global. If you're a small newspaper and you go on the internet, you're now global. And so most of the news media are going on the internet in some format or another, and they are now global. Unidirectional, that means that the media sent the message out to everybody, and there was some ability to respond. You could write a letter to the editor. You could cancel your subscription. There are ways of sending a message back. I mentioned my first job when the general manager decided to change the entire newspaper based on two friends telling him he thought we were too controversial and destroying the newspaper by following his two friends' advice. So there are ways to give feedback, but not nearly like it is today. And so now I would call today's media landscape more omnidirectional. It's not just bidirectional, it is bidirectional. We can now talk back much more easily, and most media invite you to talk back. They've tried to be more social and more bidirectional, but also what they cannot control at all is the omnidirectional nature of social media and the internet, where you're not just talking to them, now you're talking to each other, and you're you all the way back, and we'll get to this in a second when we talk a little bit about research. One of the theories that the team who talked about the theories from the Lowell book did not talk about was the uses and gratifications theory, and I will talk about that a little bit more. But right now, I mention it because the uses and gratifications is one of the strongest theories that refutes the original theory. The original theory was the direct theory, where back in the 1930s, that's when basically everybody thought scary. The radio, then there was no TV networks yet. They were experimenting with TV. It's not inaccurate to say that TV was invented in the 1940s, the 1950s. It was actually invented in the late 1920s, but they didn't actually implement it yet. There was no network. Nobody had anything to watch. So even though it was invented earlier, there was nothing to watch yet. And so the networks really began in the 1950s. But in the 1930s, the radio, people would sit around, they'd have one big radio. They weren't small and portable in those days. So they'd have one big radio in the middle of their living room, and everybody'd sit around and listen to the radio. Whether it was news, whether it was, they started soap operas, what you might call novellas or serials in other countries, but basically the ongoing story that you start, getting, in some of the serials are decades old in America. That they, in fact, some of them still going today may well have had their beginning in the 1930s. They may be literally that old. They transitioned from the radio to TV, and people, mostly women, are watching these same soap operas, serials even today. They're called soap operas because Procter & Gamble was the first big sponsor of them, and they made soap. They were most famous for their soap, and so they advertised their soap on these serial productions, and they were called soap operas. Anyway, in that time, everybody thought that the radio and media was so powerful that it was kind of like open somebody's head and pour in the information, and the influence was very direct. But even then, they fairly quickly, in the late 1930s and the early 1940s, psychologists and sociologists started getting involved in communication research. And they figured out very quickly that the direct influence was not that great. That despite how much advertising you bought and so forth, you were not controlling the general public, their opinion. The elections were not going to the person who had the most money consistently to advertise with. And they started, in talking to the voters and so forth, they found that a lot of them were talking to each other. Sound familiar? Social media, they were talking to each other and then deciding how to vote. And so what we have now in our social media is a way to facilitate our talking to each other. And it's enlarged it dramatically, because now we can talk, each other is maybe all the way around the world. So I can have influence on my friends in America, even when I'm living in Malaysia, because we're still talking to each other, and I express my political opinions to them, and we share ideas and so forth. And so the social media has enhanced what they found out 80 years ago, which is that the media do not have as much power as they think they have. Anyway, we'll go into some of the other theories and how that impacts, but basically it's saying that people use the media the way they want to, and they have more power, they're more active participants than what was originally thought. It was originally thought that the listeners, the audience was all passive, and the media was affecting them very directly, and they didn't consider any other elements, but with their research they found not so true. With the 20th century model, there were relatively few producers of media, partly because it's just the next one, so expensive. The press, the daily newspaper I used to work for was like a $50 million press to print the newspaper every day. The New York Times has bigger presses than that, and I went to their press room. They have about 10 presses running at the same time in order to put out as many. They have a circulation of 900,000 newspapers a day, and so they have lots and lots of presses printing at the same time. So you're talking about, you're getting to somewhere around $500 million, or maybe even closer to $1 billion of printing equipment that they have to maintain and purchase and maintain to put out their newspapers. So it's not something that you and I can compete with. We don't have a few $1 million sitting in our pocket that we can go buy our own press, but we do have enough money for one of these. And that's what the 21st century is all about, is that unlike the 20th century, now when we buy the equipment that we need to be consumers, we buy the equipment we need to be producers. And so we are now both producers and consumers. And that has upset the entire world and has greatly minimalized the power of these great media conglomerates that are now fighting back to try to somehow regain control that they lost, and that they clearly lost in the last election. And so when you start, when they did a content analysis study where they looked at the content of the media, and they said in the last quarter, I think it's over the summer basically, 91% of all the stories written about Trump were negative. That is a huge percentage. But I'm telling you, even though he does stupid things to draw some of the bad press, he really does, I know that, but not that bad. For example, they don't cover the fact that the stock market in America is at record high. They don't cover the fact very well that the employment is at record lows, and that even the minorities, including the African Americans, their employment rate is much higher than it has been in decades under Trump. That they don't report. So they're reporting his style. His style is bad. He needs to stop. He needs to get off the internet. Basically, he needs to allow some professional handlers to handle him, but he won't. And so, in some cases, what's odd about Trump is that many of the people have complained about presidents not being very open. Trump is totally open. They have no right to complain that he's not open. He's too open. I think almost everybody believes he's too open, both pro and con. Those that like him and those who don't like him. He's too open. Shut up. Some of the things he accused are simply that he talks too much. He says stupid things. But he's open. He is open. He's the most open president they've ever had, much to the chagrin of many people who support him. They want him to shut up a little bit more. Stop tweeting. But that's part of the new media landscape. He does not want to let people go after him at 91% rate, say bad Trump, bad Trump, bad Trump, and so he's getting on Twitter and saying, not so bad, you're bad, you're bad. It sounds like a kindergarten fight between little kids sometimes, but that's the new media landscape we're in. He can do that. And then his tweets become major stories. Anyway, I'm kind of tired of it myself. And I think that the media could cover issues better and tweets less. So anyway, those are the, again, key aspects of that video, but of our discussion overall, is that in the 21st century, our media is global, it's social, ubiquitous. It's kind of like living in water. Our media is all around us. It is part of our life. We are, as one person said, we are part of a giant computer. All of us are linked to the great computer in the sky, so to speak. I mean, all the servers in the world are linked together. And so in a sense, they're all one giant computer. And we're part of that computer. I don't know, that may be over-exaggerating the point, but that's what one expert says. In essence, we are part of the internet. And it'll become more so. You've heard of, if you don't understand yet, the Internet of all things, where they start putting chips in your shoes and every place else, in your coffee cups to tell you how warm your coffee cup is, and everything else. They'll put chips in your refrigerator to tell you when you're out of milk, when you need to go buy milk. There's going to be chips every place. And so if we're part of the great computer of the world now, guess what it will be as the Internet of all things develops? Then, like I say, we'll be walking computers. We'll have internet chips. Some people are already starting to embed them in bodies as ways of tracking people to make sure that they're safe. They think that's a good thing. Dogs, animals, pets are more often being chipped, so to speak, to make sure they don't run away and get lost. But there's an employer that they say it's not, that it's a chip that others can't get into, but they're asking for the employees to voluntarily be chipped for ID purposes. Anyway, it's getting into, like I say, there's some things that are very scary about it, but we are part of the big computer in the world. In the just to look real quickly at the questions that I raised in this PowerPoint, Jack Luell doesn't talk about the different ages in the same way that Poe does. So beware when I ask questions, whether I'm asking about Poe or Luell, for example. They cover things a little differently. Poe does not, or rather Luell does not cover everything that Poe does. So I'm kind of giving you a hint. That would be, you might consider that a trick question, but it is an accurate question. Luell covers some things, Poe covers other things. So kind of be aware of what they cover. This was one covered in this PowerPoint, the different types of convergence. Some of these are not accurate. Some of these are not convergences that we talked about. I'm not going to, when you go to another slide, there's a slide where it tells you which ones are talked about. I'm going to make you look. I'm not going to answer that question for you. Some of these are not accurate. And these are different types of media literacy, or different elements of media literacy. And one of these I said was not in their list from this organization that I thought should have been there. And that's on another slide. I'll let you look up. Okay, I'm going to close that one and go on to another one. Let's go to team 2. This is the one kind of on research and so forth. And so I added this slide because I thought it was important. I thought the use and gratification theory was too important to ignore. So I did add this one, so I'm just going to talk about it a little bit right now. These theorists focus on how the public consumes media messages. So that's kind of an overview of it. The theory suggests, however, that consumers control the media content by selecting those channels and messages that are useful to them or that provide them some kind of gratification. So you choose what you consume. Okay, that's the emphasis of this theory. Therefore, the media does not have as much power as they think they do, because you choose what you consume for your purposes. You choose them, you use them, rather than they use you. This directly counters, as I said earlier, the direct effects theory that was the original theory in the 1930s. The direct effects theory that doesn't say they have no effect, but other theories better explain the effect of the media. The direct effect theory is pretty much dead. Nobody thinks it has that much of a direct effect anymore. They explain in other ways, like the agenda setting theory that the group did talk about. But anyway, this proposed that the audience is an active rather than passive participant. So that's the use and gratifications theory you need to be aware of. I also, let me make sure I got all the blue ones that I highlighted. Okay. The team also only covers some of the methods of researching, and some of these I would say are fairly minor, but I want to draw them to your attention because experimentation is not minor. It's maybe not used as much, and same with participant observation is very close to experimentation, because you're trying to measure real people. In both cases, you're trying to measure real people. So this is kind of the realm in some cases of psychologists and sociologists have done quite a few experiments in this realm of experimentation and participant observation. The last two are a little bit more kind of like content analysis, but not quite. But anyway, so experimentation, that's obvious. You know what experimentation is. And direct observation is basically you observe what exactly they do. And so, for example, one of the things that they observed in one study, it also related to rhetorical analysis and to some degree social role analysis. It actually involves several of these. And that's, I guess, true of quite a few studies, that they fall in more than one category. So it's not so easy to say, I'm going to use this one type of study. So one of them, we can decide, I'll tell you what they did, and then we can decide which one it falls into. But in this case, they studied people in the newsroom. And I think I already told you about this, but then let me remind you if I did. They studied what happened depending on how strong of an editor they had. So that's a little bit in the role analysis. But anyway, if the editor was really strong, and he demanded that people do things his way, and if he, for example, demanded fairness, demanded as much objectivity as a reporter could muscle up, then the results were that that's what they would get. And my interpretation of that is that I think I mentioned early in the course, is that people write to somebody. In your mind, when you write to somebody. You may in this class be writing to me. And yet, one thing I'm telling you in this assignment is write as if you're writing to somebody who was not in this class, who was not at the conference. And if you don't adopt that perspective of writing to somebody who was not here, you will do badly in your writing. Because you will presume that people understand things that I, yes, do understand, but I'm going to look at it as if I didn't understand. And so I'm going to pretend that I'm not me. I'm going to pretend that I'm that person that was not here. And so if you don't write to me as a person who was not here, you're going to do badly in your writing. So write as if I am not here, that I don't know this stuff. And so you don't assume that I know stuff that I in reality do know, because I'm going to look at it and grade it based on the idea that I'm not here and I don't know. And I'm pretty good at that because as an editor, that's what I have to do. As an editor, I have to always look at people's stories as if I were the reader outside the newsroom. It doesn't matter what I know. It matters what our readers know. And so I have decades of experience removing myself and pretending that I'm not me, so to speak. It's pretty much habitual now. And that's how I'll grade your material. So anyway, so my perspective on this is that when you have a strong editor, who are the reporters writing to? They're writing to their editor. He demands that they write to him. He demands that he write the way he wants them to write, or they're going to get fired. So in their mind, they're writing to the editor. However, if they have an editor who's not very demanding, who's kind of laid back and, do your own thing, I trust you as reporters, do a good job, what happens is what is happening a lot in this day and age, actually, right now, is the reporters kind of go off and they forget their objectivity. They forget their fairness. They forget balancing their sources. They start flipping their opinions in there. They start agenda setting, going back to that word, agenda setting. They start deciding that they're going to cover this subject instead of that subject because this means something to them. And so they start dictating what people are talking about, like Trump tweeting. That becomes their agenda. Trump tweeted something else. Let's write a story about it. I think that's stupid myself as a newsman. That's not an issue. That should not be a major issue that everybody writes about every day, is Trump's tweets. Okay, I think that's stupid. But nonetheless, in the current environment, they're writing about his tweets every day. And that has become, they have set that agenda that Trump's tweets are right up here someplace as the important issues of the day, what he tweets. Well, somebody set that agenda. And I guarantee it wasn't the press as favorable to Trump. But even they are kind of dragged into it. You'll notice, even though Fox is a little more pro-Trump, they get dragged into this issue of writing about his tweets because they're more mainstream media than Fox media, and they set the agenda even for Fox in some cases, let alone for the discussion of all the rest of us. So that's where the agenda setting, by the way, comes in, is that by the dominant media, what they choose to write about becomes the agenda for our discussion. Donald's tweets. And it even, like I say, even to some degree controls Fox. They feel like it kind of falls under another, I don't know if it's a formal theory, but at least it's an accusation that media are kind of PAC oriented. They call it PAC journalism. The leader of the PAC sets the agenda, and everybody else runs after the leader of the pack, like a pack of dogs. And so a lot of journalists themselves criticize PAC journalism, where everybody has to write about the same stuff because they're afraid that if they don't write about it, then people are going to say, oh, you didn't cover the issues. You didn't cover what these other people covered. And so they all write about the same stuff. And so it becomes a little bit of it's beyond agenda setting. It goes then, like I say, I don't think there's a formal theory of it, but even the journalists themselves talk about PAC journalism. They themselves criticize PAC journalism, and it occurs all the time. So it's kind of part of the agenda setting. I don't think it's been formalized as part of that theory, but maybe it should be discussed as a separate theory, because it is real. It is absolutely real. Anyway, so there's that. So when we're talking then about this study that I just was talking about, so they're talking about the social role, the interrelationship between the reporters and the editors. That makes it social role analysis. Social roles, however, can also relate to even things about how they characterize, how they talk about women, for example, would fall in the social role. So a newspaper in some countries might kind of look down on women as being lesser class citizens, so to speak. I mean, there are some countries where women can't even drive. I think Saudi Arabia just barely gave women the right to drive. So they're going to look at women a little bit differently. And so somebody doing a study might cover social role analysis from that perspective, but the relationship between the media and women, for example. The relationship of media and different, besides women, maybe homosexuals, for example, might be a social role. How do they treat people who have a different sexual orientation would be a matter of study. So that kind of gets into there. Rhetorical analysis would be kind of like content analysis, but it's a little bit less scientific, I would say, where you start analyzing words that they use. For example, I think I've said in this class, I've warned you not to use the word claim very much. He claimed, because the connotation of the word claimed is that there's some doubt that he's telling the truth or that he's accurate. And so unless you really want to give that connotation, you don't use that word. So we try to, most editors in America tell their reporters to just use the word to say. Said. That's it. Don't give any connotation to it. And it doesn't attract attention to itself. They really do not notice. Readers do not notice that it's the only word you use for attribution. Said. Until you start mixing it. Then they notice it. Then when you start trying to use other verbs, they start noticing it, and you're more likely to use a verb that is not a good verb, like claimed, that there's something wrong with the use of it in biasing or whatever. Some people use things like laughed. Well, you can't laugh an attribution. It's a misuse of the word. You can't laugh it. You can't smile it. He smiled. He said something, he smiled. As the attribution for saying it. Well, you can't smile an attribution either. So there's a lot of people try to use other words, and if you're writing a novel, go ahead. It's fine with me. But you're not writing a novel. So stay away from other verbs of attribution. Anyway, the participant observation could also, this study that I told you about, that could be participant observation. You're watching how they interact with each other, and you're just observing. It's not really an experiment. So you're observing the interaction of people in a newsroom, for example. So these kind of overlap with each other. But I want you to know there's other types of research that were not covered in that presentation, and anyway, just be aware of them. Let me go up, I mentioned already, but maybe spiral of silence. Let me talk about this one too, and then the agenda setting also. This one is somewhat limited by the fact that not everybody, it's not a real high, probably a real high portion of the population that is guilted into being quiet. At least it hasn't been. Actually, I would say this is a theory that's becoming more true with this concept of being politically correct, is that you can get in big, I've gotten in trouble with university students in America who have been politicized by their professors, by their liberal professors. I think I may have mentioned this to you, but I was talking about my nephew. I've talked about my nephew with a 70 IQ. And I referred to him with the word retarded, because that is clinically retarded is an accurate scientific word. His progress has been retarded by the fact that he doesn't have a high IQ. And the students I was talking to just went crazy, because that word has become unacceptable in American society. You can't use the word retarded. No matter how accurate it is, no matter if you're using it in a scientific manner, and doesn't matter even if you're using it positively. Because I used it in the very same way I did it here when I was explaining that I would not try to compete with my 70 IQ nephew on things about nature. He knows way more than I do, because he sits there and watches TV all the time. He can't read, but he watches TV and he loves nature shows and watches them all the time. And so the whole point was to try to point out how we have our intelligence. We have different types of intelligence. And some of us are smart in one area, and I would dare say all of us are retarded in some parts, some areas of intelligence. All of us are retarded. And that's a perfectly good word. That I would say I'm a little bit, well, I'm definitely not as socially intelligent as my brother by a long ways. Being somewhat introvert, I would say that almost by definition, somebody by introvert is a little bit retarded in their social intelligence. So I'm retarded. So, I think it's a perfectly good, good use of the word. But they went crazy. They wanted me hung, basically. They were really mad that I used that word. Very odd, because it wasn't in a negative way. It was actually in a positive way, explaining how smart my nephew was, despite having a 70 IQ. In some areas, he was very smart. Anyway, so that has silenced me. To a large degree. I'm very careful when I use the word retarded, because those students went crazy. Those students from Central Washington University had made that word politicized, or socially unacceptable to ever use that word in any context. Not acceptable. And there's lots of others. And it's not, for example, I had one of my Kazakhstan friends went to Michigan State University for one semester. And in class, I'm not sure what the subject overall was, but she made the comment, as being somebody who would like to migrate to America, and a lot of people around the world would. She said that it seemed to her that African Americans were still angry about slavery. And yet America is still a place where if you work hard enough, you can succeed. The whole class, including the professor, were upset with her that she would dare say that if you worked hard enough in America, you could succeed. Because they have this attitude that they are, they have a defeatist attitude, a persecuted attitude, and that's their narrative. And in fact, there was just recently some African Americans went to the president of a university and asked him to stop bringing in so many real Africans, because real Africans are doing well in American universities, and so they're feeling put down by the real Africans, not the non-American Africans, and so that basically what this young lady who was Kazakh, somewhat tanned herself, because the Kazakhs are kind of a Mexican color, nice tan like a lot of you have, beautiful tan. She dared say that if a person worked hard enough, they could succeed in America. And so she was forced to apologize to the class by the professor. That's a political correctness that goes right to the spiral of silence, where, guess what? She's going to be very careful about what she says in the future, wouldn't she? Or when her professor says, you can't say that. That is, I'm not sure exactly how but she emailed me and said, what do I do? What did I do wrong, Ken? What did I do wrong? You broke their narrative. You can't say that anybody can succeed in America. That goes against their narrative. Even though all the immigrants do. The immigrants come from India, they succeed. The immigrants come from Africa, they succeed. Immigrants come from Asia, they succeed. But the African Americans don't want to buy into that narrative. And so you can't say they can succeed. Even though there's lots of examples of them succeeding, there's some great, black Americans who have succeeded, some, amazing ones. But they do not want to say that they have the freedom to succeed if they work hard enough. They don't want that narrative. So, spiral of silence, yeah. You have to be very careful. If I were teaching in America, I'd be very careful as a professor. Absolutely careful. Because you lose your job for saying something that to me is extremely legitimate. I don't think my Kazakh friend said anything wrong. I think she was right. At least it was a valid opinion, even if you disagreed with her. If you're going to allow discussion, that should be a legitimate perspective. And it is the perspective of most people who want to go to America. That's why millions and millions of people want to go to America. They believe if they go there and clean toilets at first, they can ultimately succeed. When I have friends who have literally done that. They've gone to America on a student visa. They probably are no longer there legally. They're cleaning toilets at first, and they're working their way up, from toilet cleaners to whatever. One of them owns a event planning company now. So they believe it. The immigrants all believe it. And that's why the African Americans were upset that these real Africans were coming and thinking they could succeed, of all the terrible things to think. But that's the spiral of silence. So the perspective that says it is not a good argument, are saying that the phenomenon of spiral of silence is most visible in just individuals who have a fear, that are fearful of social isolation. That is what the book says. Now, I disagree with that, but if I ask a question, I'm going to be asking it in the perspective of the book. I'm saying that this is probably much bigger than what the theorists believe it is, because the theorists are mostly liberal. And so they control, again, the agenda of theory. And they're going to they're not going to want to buy into that this idea of being PC, politically correct, is part of the spiral of silence. But I think it very much is. Very much is. Where is the? There it is. Okay, so the agenda setting, they did talk about this, and just draw it to your attention. You should be aware of the agenda setting theory. I believe it's a very real thing. I think it is an important theory. The criticism is that it cannot be proven. A lot of things are very hard to prove in communications. For example, the effect of violence on TV or sex on TV and in the media. It's very difficult to prove what the impact of that is. You have a lot of high correlations. It took decades before we could prove that smoking was bad for your health. Decades. The cigarette companies in America fought that tooth and nail and said, you can't prove it, that's a correlation. Correlation is not causation. Just because people get cancer that smoke does not mean that smoking caused cancer. That was their argument. And they still make that sort of argument with the content of the media. However, places that don't have a lot of pornography, a lot of them have very low incidence of rape, for example. But they maybe find some other examples of other countries, other societies where they do have lots of pornography, and they say, well, pornography actually prevents rape. So it is true that it is difficult to prove. You can't, for example, set up an experiment. I'm going to show this person lots of pornography and see if he goes rape somebody. Okay, that's kind of an experiment you don't want to do, and you can't. And it's not going to affect everybody the same anyway. The effects of things like violence and sex on TV is not universal. It's not direct effect. So going back to that idea of the 1930s, it's not direct effect, definitely. It's much more complicated than that. And so you have some people, I mentioned, what was his first name? Bundy, Ted Bundy, that's right. Ted Bundy, who claimed that his killing 36 women or whatever came from basically the violent pornography that he was introduced to as a teenager, as a young teenager. I tend to think he's telling the truth about himself. He's the one who experienced it, and he made that proclamation right before he was put to death, and he had no reason to think he would not be put to death. That he believed that violent pornography caused him to change the way he was thinking and what he did in his life. Now, in my other class of success strategies, I'm going to teach you we all are free to choose what we do. And that is, I do believe that. We all choose how we respond to different stimuli. But I do have, actually my youngest daughter was married to somebody who was introduced to pornography like at 8 years old. And it ended up destroying their marriage, as he became addicted to it. And on the outside, very, very nice guy, but ultimately he ended up doing weird things, breaking his promises to my daughter, driven by his pornography addiction. So is there a correlation? I'd say so. Is there some causation? I think so. But it just can't be, again, if you experiment on it, you can't, it's not going to be every person if you dare do it, everybody you expose to violent pornography is not going to become Ted Bundy. Everybody that you expose at a young age to normal pornography is not going to become my ex-son-in-law. It's more complicated. So that's kind of the same argument with some of these other things, is that it's hard to test them. Agenda setting studies are unable to prove cause and effect. I think it's obvious. Personally, I think it's obvious I can't even see how it can be argued against. But if you want to argue, that's how do you prove it? How do you prove cause and effect with it? It's theory. It's hard to do. A lot of things in communications are hard to do. Okay, we need to move on. Okay, enough for that topic. Okay, so let's get to particularly talk. All right, too many things open here. Okay, so I'm going to go through the questions in this one, and particularly, and kind of criticize the questions first off. Or review them and criticize them where I think necessary, let me put it that way. And suggest where I might change them. I might still include something. This one I'd say this is a good topic, and there may be a question on this, but this one is kind of easy by the very way the answer is given. Stay calm and observe people discuss something. Yeah, it's a little bit easy. So the answers I think are a little bit too easy. So I might use it somehow. I might use dialectic somehow, but it might not be exactly in this format. So be aware of what Plato and his theory, you might say, of dialectic being, obviously the correct one is A in this one. That is dialectic, reason, discussion, a kind of debate in which people present arguments and other real people affirm them by means of logic is the best way to find truth, according to Plato. Others would obviously argue with him. So that doesn't necessarily mean he's right. And he lived in a day and age a long time before other media. So he'd never had Google, for example, where real truth can be found in Google. I don't know. So I might, I would, if I use this, I will put it in a different setting. But just remember what dialectic is, and you'll not be tricked by my other questions. This one also I might change a little bit. The answer to this one is B, relevance. I might throw, again, kind of easy. You basically just have two options here. I might throw some other things in there to try to trick you a little bit. But anyway, just be aware that's what it is, and you won't be tricked by me. This one's okay. I mean, it's a little bit, you should know the answer to this one. What is the first uniquely human medium? Is speech, talk. We haven't talked about any of the other media yet, so it has to be the right answer. But it is true also. So again, I might make that, I might use that, might put it in a little bit different setting, but that's what it is. Going down to some other questions. Hello. Okay. This one I'd say is inaccurate in a sense, because this is basically just putting in different order all these same words, kind of, more or less. And so it's kind of, the order doesn't matter. When I went back, had to go back to make sure the book didn't suggest that it had to be in the right order. And even if it was, it's not. If you're talking about the tools, the way it's worded, these are all tools with the medium of talk. These are the tools you need. No matter what order you put them in, these are all the tools you need. So if I use this question, I will not be using just these three words over and over again. Different. I'm going to throw other words in there. So just be aware that he says that these are the tools. But anyway, I would say this is not an accurate question, because no matter what order you put them in, they're still the tools. This one is incorrect, at least the question is a little bit worded a little strangely, so I'm not exactly sure. But by my understanding of the question, it's incorrect. The only one that is basically correct is that when it's talking about the senses, your body senses, you don't smell speech. You don't taste speech. Okay, you don't touch speech. You hear speech. And so it's when you're talking about, that's one of his the issues with fidelity. Just how accurate is your communication depends how many senses. The more multisensory your communications are, the more likely it's to be accurate. So if you can see it, for example, with video, that greatly enhances your ability to remember something than if all you're doing is hearing it. So part of his definition of fidelity relates to how many senses are you using. And so I would say the answers to this are incorrect. You're not seeing speech, you're not feeling speech, you're not tasting speech, you're not smelling speech. You are hearing and you're hearing speech, which makes it a low fidelity medium, because we don't remember speech as well as multimedia communications. So that one I say is an inaccurate question. This one may be part of. First off, you have to understand that Poe. This is not an exact number. This is Poe's number. But he was kind of extrapolating. Well, about how far can you speak and people easily hear you without equipment, without a loudspeaker or something? how far can you speak? And he figured, okay, 20 to 30 feet in every direction. It's omnidirectional. And in those 20 and 30 feet, you could pack 800 people into it. That's not an exact number. 20 to 30 is not an exact number. It would depend on, some of you are soft-spoken, other people speak loudly. And so for you, it's a very individualized thing. Some of you could talk to more people than other people could. So what's the average? Is it around 800? That's Poe saying that. That is not a real scientific calculation. That is kind of his estimate. Be aware that's his estimate. Yeah, I mean, I'll accept that, that a question that suggests that about 800 people could hear you speak on average for the average person. That's fine, but I would not give this to you exactly this way because it's an inexact science. And he's totally coming up with it in his own brain. He did not do experiments to do this. He did this out of his own brain. He did some math here and kind of did his calculations. It's not an exact number. And so is it 800? Is it 700? Is it 900? I don't know. And he doesn't know. It's not an exact, he did not do experiments to come up with this number. He did his math out of his own brain. He did cite a little bit of science here and there, but it was not a real carefully conducted scientific study that he did. And so, especially the last three numbers, it's probably somewhere, it's not an exact number anywhere. And it depends so much on the people. He would have to, basically to be scientifically valid, he'd have to get at least 100 people together, and he'd have to, then what do you define as being easy communication? Can you raise your voice a little bit? Or is that cheating? Do you have to speak normally? Is that what you're saying? Or can you shout? He's saying you can't shout, because you can shout further than 30 feet. You can shout 50 feet or so. So you can't shout. So who's going to set the rules for this? So anyway, so be aware that he thinks somewhere in the 800 is how many people you can talk to somewhat normally. Maybe raising your voice a little bit, but it's not an exact number. So this number may show up, but be aware that I don't consider it an exact number, and it's probably going to be in some other context, not just, it won't be this question. Okay, I'm not going to give you this question because it's not an exact number, and I know that, and I'm telling you that right now. But he does say about 800. That's true. Okay, so I've already done a little bit of rewriting in this question. Which of the following statements is not true regarding attributes of speech? Okay, I've shown you which one in this PowerPoint. This may not be the way it appears on the quiz, or it might be. I don't even know whether it is. But I did some rewriting on it because I wanted to make sure that it was a little bit clearer and that we'd have something to discuss. So the accessibility of speech is high, diffused, and equalized. Why is it accessible? So let's talk about these terms. I want you to understand these terms. So why is speech accessible? Why is it considered high accessibility? Because you all have brains and mouths and ears. So everybody can do it. So it's even more accessible than this. Okay, is because most people, all of you and most people in the world have all the tools they need for speech. So it's highly accessible in that sense. Speech's high velocity gives it rise to dialogic network. Velocity in this case relates to how quickly you can formulate the message and exchange it. So what it's saying is basically you can talk to people real fast. You can talk to your friends. You don't have to plan out. You don't have to type it up. You don't have to. It doesn't take you a lot of time to figure out your messages when you're talking to your friends. So it's high velocity. It takes a short time to formulate in your brain, out your mouth. Some people, like Donald Trump, it's too fast. Okay, so you need to maybe formulate a little bit more than he does. But high velocity in your ability to produce this form of communication. Speech's low persistence contributes to ritualized social practice. Okay, so persistence in this case means that you're going to forget what you said and what somebody said to you. I think I've mentioned that even in your writing your news stories for this class. Write so accurately that somebody you talk to won't remember whether you're right or wrong. That's usually like a day or so. Especially when you're talking about word perfect. You know, did that person really quote me exactly right? After a day, you won't know. And so as long as you get the essence right and most of the words are correct and you're wrong with one or two words in a direct quote, they don't know, I won't know, it's okay. Some students have quoted me and I know they're way off. That's a problem. If I know I did not say that, that's a little bit of a problem. So be somewhat close. But in some cases, they quoted me saying stuff I didn't even talk about. Well, now that's a problem. That's a big problem. I want you to be more accurate than to quote me as saying something I didn't talk about. Be somewhat accurate. Make sure the essence is accurate. But being off a word or two, because of this very fact, because of the lack of persistence of this medium, as reporters, you don't have to be absolutely 100% correct and have everybody rave about how accurate you are, by the way. I've had lots and lots of people say how accurate a reporter I am, rave about it. And I know I'm not, because I've gone back and listened to the video recordings that I made of it, or the tape recordings, and I wasn't exactly right. But they think I am, because they don't remember. They know I know that I was, the essence of what I wrote was right. But in some cases, I know absolutely I was not word perfect. But they rave about my accuracy because of the lack of persistence in this medium. People forget very quickly. Now, that's about being word perfect, but it's not, probably you would remember the essence of what you said in a conversation a month ago, but somebody you talk to may not. And that's one reason I think I mentioned before why you need contracts in business. Because you will not, you both, two best friends, will not remember exactly what you agreed to. And this can cause problems in the future. And so you can't, the persistence of speech is just too low to depend on. Ritualization means things like in religions, they say the same stuff over and over again in some cases. In the Catholic masses, they would pretty much say the same stuff over and over again. A lot of religions, and not just religions, but other societies and associations have rituals that they go through to help their members remember, their members of their organization, whatever it is, to remember the content of that. And in the old days, before the other media, there was more of that. There was more, you might not, maybe ritual isn't the right word, but it's close enough. The elders would sit around the campfire and tell their stories over and over and over again, same stories, because all the generations they were passing those stories along to the next generation and to the next generation. That was the only medium they had. And so they would tell the same stories, and people would, in some cases, they would try to memorize these stories so they could pass the stories of their people on to the next generation. But the low persistence makes it problematic. And that's where I had some argument with whether it's really that searchable, because persistence is, to me, like I say, if Google has no persistence, it's not very useful. Okay, if Google changes every day and what its memory is, it's not very searchable. We wouldn't be using Google. Part of Google's value is its persistence and its fidelity, by the way. Its fidelity and its persistence. Otherwise, we wouldn't be using it. And so it's hard to divide some of these things, and this is, again, rather arbitrary on the part of Poe of how he defines these terms. But so persistence to him is different than searchability. The range of speech is low but intensive. So again, you have your 20 to 30 feet of comfortable speech. You can yell to 50 feet or something, and the truth is there are places where the acoustics are amazing and you can get more than that. But typically you are somewhat constrained by the range of speech, as opposed to a lot of the other media that have very little constraint in their range. Privacy is kind of hard to, he mentions, hard to hide your identity. We all have distinct voices. Our voices are like our fingerprints. They're all distinctive. I mean, that a lot of security systems are based on somebody speaking into a computer and the computer identifying that person's speech. So they might have to put their fingers up there also. It may identify their fingerprints and their speech. Now they're going to the eyes. But there's different ways of identifying people, but speech is one of the easiest. And so when you're talking to somebody, if somebody overhears you, they're going to know who it is that's talking if they've been around you very much. And by the very nature of it, it's kind of, we tend to talk in somewhat open areas and people overhear us all the time. So it's not a very private type of communications. Of course, a lot of the other media don't try to be private, but they can be private. It can be more easily kept quiet or private. We see that even with the internet, of course, that was one of the big issues of the last American election. Things that were supposed to be private became not private. So the issue of secrecy and privacy in the internet is a big issue. Big issue to governments, because a lot of their secrets are being revealed by hackers that they don't want revealed. And so it's a major issue for corporations, for governments, is the privacy of the internet. Anyway. And then I worded this kind of, gave the whole kind of bigger picture of it. Because it has low persistence and fidelity, searchability of speech is low. That's incorrect. That despite the fact, you could say, despite the fact that it has low persistence of fidelity, Poe considers searchability as high because it's quick, it's easy. We remember stuff quickly and easily. My argument is yeah, but not for very long, and not and our very consumption of it wasn't very accurate because it's only sound and it's not multimedia. So fidelity is low. Persistence is low, but in the sense of how quickly you can access it, and everybody can access their memory rather quickly, it's very searchable in that sense. So be aware that the difference does not deal with persistence. So that's, I got a little confused about this myself, so I wanted to go in and look at it a little bit closer. I still, again, this is only Poe's definitions. So I can only, for our quiz, we're going to go with Poe's. If I'm going to argue with them, it will be in, I could word a question, does Dr. Ken agree with Poe that speech is highly searchable? And you might say no, but that's not going to be the question. Okay, it will be based on Poe's book, that he considers it searchable by his definition. I don't want to confuse you any more than I already have. So, okay. Which of the following statements is not true about the features of human voice when speaking? Human voice can spread in all directions, omnidirectional, that's true. Movement of human voice is like radio waves. Well, that's because, again, it's omnidirectional pretty much. And it also is like radio waves in other ways, in that it can be blocked by physical obstruction. We can't hear people in the other, even though we're less than, even if I get right next to that wall, I can't hear the people on the other side probably, even though I may be 5 feet from them. So just, radio waves may be able to go through that wall, but radio waves are somewhat constrained by the world around it. UHF is different than VHF, and FM is different than AM. They have different types of modulation and frequencies react to the physical surroundings differently. And we won't get into that in this class. Anyway, speech is point-to-point way of communication. That's not true. That would be like a telephone or something like that, and that's not accurate with speech. And human voice is in low range, in that it doesn't go very far. So that's true. which of the following statements is not true about amateurize according to the author? Anyway, I'm going to let you look at that yourself. I didn't change that, I don't think. I think maybe highlight it, but I didn't really go into that. Going here then, this is a slide that the group made, just a review. And then I haven't put it up on Moodle, but it's maybe I will. Well, yeah, maybe you guys should have access to this chart. I might put my version of their PowerPoint online in order for you to have access to this. So this is his. This is not analysis of talk. This is just his definition, more or less. It's not a real clear definition, but it's two pages long as it is. But it gives you a little, maybe help you remember what the 8 different attributes are. And then how he would, a little bit of an idea of how he defines it. Now, let me blow this up. This is hard to see because of the small type. And, okay. So, accessibility, again, if it's highly accessible, that means it is diffused. Basically, a lot of people have access to it. Anyway, in the case of speech, it's fairly equalized, but in the case of a newspaper with multi-million-dollar presses, it would not be equalized, would it? Not everybody can have a printing press. So, be aware of that. Accessibility to producing print. See, this also gets a little more concentrated, a little bit more confusing in which way you analyze it. If you're going to say it's not highly accessible, you can say it's not highly accessible to use the media or to produce the print media. But it's fairly highly accessible to receive the print media, right? So when we get to the print media, we need to think about the difference from the perspective of a producer or a receiver. They're quite different. Same with TV. Very expensive to be a producer of TV. But it's not very expensive, typically, to be a receiver of TV. He emphasizes more the recipient. So he might say that TV is quite accessible, but be aware that it's, when you get into social practice, now it's saying hierarchical. Then you're starting to talk about the producers of TV. Elitism. Now you're talking about the producer of TV. So we need to watch very carefully, and the teams that present TV, they don't call it TV, they call it audiovisual, I think, in his book. Be aware of those two aspects. They're very different. Access to the tools to produce some of the media is not very accessible, but the receiving it is quite accessible. So you need to look at that carefully. Privacy, again, and he admits that there's a problem in his own definitions in that you can find exceptions to all of them. So when when you may label the typical, the medium in its typical use and so forth is one thing, but you need to, he kind of trying to find the typical, because there's going to be exceptions to it, let me put it that way. So again, in print, obviously you can make it private, but a lot of it is used in such a way that it's not private because they don't want it to be private. So print, for example, would be different than speech. Speech also can be private, right? You can go take a walk in the forest even if you don't have, someplace private in a building or whatever. If you're a caveman, you go walk in the forest, you can find someplace private to talk to somebody. So again, I'm not in love with this whole idea of this, all of these attributes that Poe has concocted. Fidelity, again, has a lot to do with how many senses it's using, but it may not be just that. I mean, if you're using an electronic medium, does that have fidelity not just in the multi-senses, but is the equipment itself, does it have, in and of itself, impede fidelity for some reason? In early stages of most media, the fidelity is low, and it grows and increases from a purely technical sense. And he may discuss that, and to the degree discuss it, I'm not sure, in different issues. Volume, again, he's kind of trying to analyze. Let me look at something here, my own notes. So it's related to this. So, true or false? Poe considers the velocity of speech high because it takes very little time between thinking about what you want to say, expressing it, and the message receiving the intended audience. True or false? Velocity high because of those things? Yeah. Let me read it again. Poe considers the velocity of speech high because it takes very little time between thinking about what you want to say, expressing it, and the message reaching the intended audience. Speech's low persistence contributes to ritualized, we already talked about that, ritualized social practices. The accessibility of speech is high, diffused, and equalized because we all have the tools. Because it has low persistence and fidelity, searchability of speech is low. That's obviously, we already went to that, that's false. Okay. Poe considers the accessibility of speech to be high because almost everybody has the equipment. For effective speech, this one's a long one, so listen carefully. But it's not intended to be a trick question. For effective speech, a lecture, for example, should last no more than 50 minutes, according to and so we break that every day. According to Poe, resulting in the expression of perhaps 7,500 words. Because the range of effective speech is only 20 to 30 feet, one could deliver those 7,500 words to about 800 people at one time without the help of technology, meaning the total volume might be considered to be 7,500 words times 800. That's kind of the logic he uses in his book. Again, that's not an exact science. Some of you can listen longer than 50 minutes. We are well past 50 minutes, and most of you are paying attention still. And so somehow we broke his formula. Thank you very much. So that's not an exact science. He chose 50 minutes because a lot of universities limit their classes to 50 minutes, basically. He's a professor, and a lot of universities don't have 2-hour lectures for that reason, is that they want you to pay more attention, so they don't want you to going to sleep during the lecture. So he chose that number, rather arbitrary number. There's no reason to think that people can't pay attention longer than 50 minutes, but it starts to reduce, admittedly, at a certain point. Actually, in this day and age, it starts reducing after about 5 minutes, actually. So it's, if you want to get picky about it, maybe you should figure out what you can say in 5 minutes and multiply that. He totally arbitrarily chose 50 minutes to make his calculations. And then he somewhat arbitrarily decided that 7,500 was a good number to use. And then he somewhat arbitrarily said 20 to 30 feet was the range. And he figured you could pack 800 people into those 20 to 30 feet. And so he multiplied all of that, and that is his total number in figuring out the volume, basically. So first off, that is not an exact science either. But so if I were to word a question something like that, be aware that first off, it's not an exact science. I'm quoting, I'd be quoting Poe, but I also wanted to just go through that whole formula because that's what he's saying. That's his definition, basically, of what is volume. And so it's kind of a complicated idea of what volume is. You can talk to so many people, you can say so many words, so the volume is how many words you can say, can think and say to how many people in a certain period of time. And now he's going to try to compare that to all the other media. Well, obviously, you can, if you're on radio or TV, you can talk to a lot more people than that. So that immediately changes it. Your people might not actually pay as much attention to TV or radio for a prolonged period of time, but it depends what it's about. If it's about news, probably their interest is going to ebb. If it was an exciting movie, the Bourne Identity, you're going to be paying attention. It's exciting. But then he doesn't hardly talk, so he didn't get many words in that movie. So again, all of this is somewhat arbitrary on the part of Poe. But that's the way he calculates and the way he's thinking is precisely in this situation with speech. How many words can you say before people stop listening? How many people can you say it to with some ease? And those are his calculations. So I want you to be aware that's how he's thinking. And so I kind of wanted to go through all of these accordingly to let you kind of see. I guess we didn't go to velocity yet, but again, velocity, we already kind of talked about that with speech. He's talking about basically the whole process of, from brain to mouth to ear. How long does that take? That's high velocity. How do you calculate that? And again, this is, we'll talk about it when we get there, but let's say TV. I interviewed an award-winning journalist who talked about the 2,000-pound pencil. He had been a print journalist before, but he called his work in a TV with a national network as an investigative reporter like carrying around a 2,000-pound pencil, because he would have to take his camera crew around the country. Being an investigative reporter, he was based in D.C. in Washington D.C. For one story he was talking about, he flew all the way out to San Francisco. He interviewed an illegal alien in San Francisco for about 30 minutes, and he only used 5 or 10 seconds of his interview. And so he's talking about how many hours it took to edit all the video he had to do for this story about I don't think it was just illegal aliens. It was during the time when El Salvador were having a civil war, and a lot of the El Salvadoranians were fleeing to America. And so he was talking about that. And so, he spent days researching this topic. They spent many, many hours editing that video. I don't think Poe's going to count that as the part of the velocity, but he has to count some of it. So how much is he going to count as part of the velocity when we get to audiovisual? But it's different than speech, obviously. If you're preparing messages and recording it and so forth, it's different. Your range is certainly different. If you can go on TV, you can basically, directly or indirectly, you can reach everybody in the world eventually, particularly with the recorded part of it. A lot of people in here are probably watching some TV shows on cable from America and so forth, so you're about as far away from America as you can get. I know in Kazakhstan they watch quite a few American TV shows on their cable stations. So if you're counting the recorded portion, people it's almost unlimited. But again, do you count recording, or are you going to say it does have to be live? He's going to he makes up the rules and what he's going to count. But you can also record voice, obviously, but that's with more technology, so that doesn't count. Persistence, we already talked about persistence. Obviously, the saying is that, for example, the internet is forever. Nothing ever gets destroyed from the internet. That may be a little bit of an exaggeration, but It's enough true that people have to be very careful what gets on the internet. And then we already talked a lot about searchability. But those are the characteristics that you need to be kind of hopefully you have a little bit better idea of how he defines these terms. And again, I suggest that they are somewhat arbitrary in lots of cases. But he's trying to, the end result is I think is pretty good, but he's trying to compare all these different media in this way. I just kind of question his approach to it a little bit. But okay, G Money Christmas. Let me, I just need to end real fast here. And I should have gone over more of the writing, I'm sorry. Okay, let me just go over this one and explain what's wrong with this example. China Professional Communications Conference would grammatically say was held at China University, Malaysia. Lecturers and students attended the conference discussing the academic issues. Okay, first off, that's a boring lead. One of the first requirements is to find something to emphasize in the lead that's interesting. That's all paragraph 2 stuff. I'm sorry, we're not seeing this, are we? Okay, let me blow it just a little bit. Okay, the stuff in this first paragraph is all paragraph 2 stuff, not paragraph 1 stuff. During the conference, attendees and history of media are in high enthusiastic. That's your opinion. Don't give your opinion. That's not objective. Ken Harvey, PhD, and his students majorly not really well used here, but largely discussed. So you're going past tense. You have a date already, so go past and discussed the news writing, media, culture, and history of communications. Through the presentation of Dr. Ken, AP style I mentioned in the critique sheet is last name only. In second reference, after you've introduced the person, your source, you go to last name only. My last name, my family name, that is, last name from American perspective, family name is Harvey. So for writing purposes, I should be Harvey in the second reference. Okay, so after you introduce me, I become just Harvey. So it's family name only by Associated Press, which is kind of considered the Bible. Their style book is the Bible of journalism in America. Okay, problem with this then, first, several. First, lead should be one sentence. One sentence. This is 2 sentences. That's one problem. There's nothing there that's interesting. That's the biggest problem. Nothing interesting here. You haven't found a whammy. You haven't found a hook to get a reader into this story yet. So that's all second paragraph stuff. Some of the stuff in the second paragraph could also be still in the second paragraph, or that could even go, if you wanted to summarize more, make a third paragraph. Like I said, there's nothing magic about 2 paragraphs. It can go 3 if you want to. But so far, there's no lead. This is all second and third paragraph stuff that has been written in this example. Let's go to the internet real quick and go to the A example. Go very carefully over the critique sheet also. Okay, the example on Moodle. What? Oh, sorry. Oh. Try that again. Get in a hurry. Okay, so look at this lead instead. Maybe blow it up a little bit too. Okay, so the attempt here is to find something interesting. So, and one of the things I very specifically said and recommended is that you use what I call the speech interview lead. And that is something interesting, somebody said. Very simple formula. Something interesting, somebody said. That's the formula. And so it should be somewhat summative. It should somewhat summarize an important part of the story, because it's going to lead you into your story. A lead leads. That's one reason why we call it a lead. It leads into your story. And so one purpose is to get your attention, but a second purpose is to help summarize what your story is all about. And so you're not trying to trick people into reading your story by writing a lead that has nothing to do with your story. Okay, you want the lead to lead into your story. So in this case, marketing and PR in the 21st century are undergoing dramatic changes, says David W. Guth, an American public relations expert visiting Malaysia. Okay, so what did he say, and who said it? Very simple. Now you might find something more interesting than this, but because you're also trying to kind of summarize the story, sometimes it is a little bit of an overview sort of statement. But if you found something more controversial, for example, he says, social media is destroying the society, says Dr. Ken Harvey. Now that's a little more controversial, and so you're going to fairly soon in that story address that what he said. So probably at least by paragraph 3, you're going to be explaining how is social media destroying society, right? So that lead has to lead into it has to have some place to go. So that pretty much controls your story. If you say something, if you quote me or somebody saying something controversial, then you need to follow up on it fairly quickly in that story. By paragraph 3 or 4, you need to be following up and explaining what you said he said in paragraph 1. Paragraph 1 is usually an indirect quote. And one of the things I taught you is that very frequently then you find a direct quote somewhere around paragraph 3, which is no longer the part of the complete lead. It is called the bridge, and it's part of the body. The bridge is part of the body. And the bridge in this case, in this example, is a direct quote that amplifies on the lead. So again, it gets fairly quickly even to that lead, which is not a real controversial lead, but it's still, for somebody into marketing, might be an interesting lead. So now the complete quote, or a complete quote that kind of amplifies and refers back to that, is with the development of databases and the ability to capture data off the internet, PR and marketing are becoming more individualized. They can hardly be called mass marketing or mass communications anymore, said Guth. Okay, so that says more or less the same thing as the lead said, but now it gives more information about it. So that is a very common technique and one that I highly recommend. In fact, sometimes when I write my stories, I go backwards. I look for paragraph 3 first. I go through my notes and I find the most interesting direct quote. And I say, oh, that's my paragraph 3. Now I take that direct quote and I make it into an indirect quote, and that's my lead. And so the first thing I may have decided in this story was paragraph 3. And then I wrote paragraph 1 based on paragraph 3. So, and then paragraph 2 is the stuff like the other attempt suggested. Here in this case, Guth was a keynote speaker for the conference, the decline of mass marketing, and then the rise of consumer-focused marketing at Chaiman University, Malaysia. On June 15th, speakers at the conference also explained how mobile technology is quickly providing broadband internet access to the most remote villages around the globe, which is having a major impact on PR marketing as well as on world cultures. Okay, so what I attempted to do here was, if you have a complicated story that's covering more than one subject, you can kind of, in your second paragraph, you can kind of touch on those other subjects as well. And so I made this lead here as part of a multi-topic story, which your story, when you get to the actual story, yours will be a multi-topic, multi-source story, which is not easy to write. It will be challenging for you. But when you start writing about what happened in 4 weeks or 5 weeks or 6 weeks, whatever it is of our class, you're going to be dealing with multi-topics and multi-sources. And so this is the sort of thing you can do is that paragraph 2, paragraph 1 gives you the thing you want to emphasize, the thing that you think will capture people's attention, but also be a good summary of what you want to write about, at least a touch on it. Paragraph 2 answers more of the who, what, when, where, and why, and how questions. The 5 W's helps the first 2 paragraphs, the complete lead, are the first 2 paragraphs. So the complete lead will try to answer to some degree all 5 of those questions. It may not do a real good job of a couple of them. For example, how and why are hard to cover very well in these 2 paragraphs, but it may touch on those. But the other ones for sure, the who, what, when, where, should be covered if it's an event. Now, if it's not an event, now sometimes you can kind of ignore the when and where because it's an interview. And you may not even mention where or when the interview took. In fact, magazines they purposely don't typically cover when and where because a magazine article is sometimes 6 months old before it's published. A freelancer writes it, they send it in the magazine, they look at all the freelance stuff sent in, and they decide, and then a couple of months later they put it in the magazine. So lots of times magazines are 6 months old. They don't want you to know that. So they use says instead of said, and they leave out the where and when because they don't want you to know. When I was competing with weekly newspapers, competing with daily newspapers, I did the same thing. I left out the when and where. I made all my articles issue-oriented articles. And so they're more magazine style because I didn't want my readers knowing that some of my interviews were a week ago and I was competing against a daily newspaper whose articles or whose sources were almost always the day before. I didn't want them to see that and think about that. So I made mine issue-oriented, left out the where and when altogether in issue-oriented articles. So that's possible if you write issue-oriented, but here we've given you a when and where. With your assignment, you've been told when it happened and where it happened. And so you have that to put into your story. Okay, do you have questions about this? Again, besides this example, you can look at this example and you can practically copy it. Ask yourself, what was said interesting and who said it? That's your lead. It's right there. Copy it. It's okay. That's your speech interview lead. So don't make it more difficult than it has to be. Put it in that format and you have a good lead. What did somebody say interesting and who said it? It's simple. And so I'm not trying, there are lots of other types of leads. But for this class, this is the only one you need. That's okay. I'm not trying to teach, this is not your reporting class or your news writing class. This is our history class, but I'm trying to teach you a little bit about news reporting to make it more practical for you. And so I'm teaching you one type of lead, just one, is all I care about. If you can learn the speech interview lead right there, I'll be happy and you'll get a good grade and you'll be happy. Okay? So use the speech interview lead right there. What did somebody say that was interesting? Who said it? Easy stuff. Paragraph 2, give the rest of the 5 W's, just like you see right there. Pretty much copy it. There it is. I'm giving you the information. I'm giving you the when and where. Giving you the name of the conference. Copy it, basically. I mean, not here, not word for word here, but the information I gave you in the quiz, in preparing your complete lead is there. And so you just need to reword it a little bit. Don't make it harder than it has to be. I don't care that it sounds a lot like mine, because that's what I'm trying to teach you. Sound a lot like me and you'll be a good professional. Just sound like me. Okay? There it is. That's my A example. Sound like that, you've got an A for that question. So again, don't try to make it harder than it is. There are some other things that we will go through before we get to the complete story, the first story you're supposed to write, because there are other aspects to this. But I think I've covered the essential ones in my discussion right here. I do encourage you to go to the, which one? Where was that? Where is the, Okay, the news report critique sheet up here. This, again, kind of explains what we're doing. Then on the Moodle site, it explains in great detail the lead and what it gives another example. The internet has totally changed the way professionals conduct modern marketing, says Chime Professor Ken Harvey. And then it gives you an example of a second paragraph. This is going back to Gus, so I just copied his and put in there from the example I already showed you. But so definitely read this part of the critique sheet, just number 1 at least. Number 2 would be helpful. As I said, the attribution needs, after the first time you refer to somebody, use their last name only. So if you use my name in the lead, use just Harvey. If you say, Dr. Ken Harvey or Professor Ken Harvey in the lead, in the second paragraph, you can just say Harvey. Okay, that's AP style, Associated Press style, which is fairly universal. You need to go through the rest of these, but not probably for this assignment, because ours is just a complete lead. So that's all you need to worry about. Okay? If there's no questions, sorry I took you late, but I wanted to make sure you understood how to do this. It's not that hard. Don't make it harder than it is. In essence, try to copy what I showed you. Obviously not word for word, but the essence of what I showed here, you can copy. What interesting did somebody say? Who said it? Then the other 5 W's, they said it at, Harvey spoke at the whatever name of the conference at Chime University on October, whatever date I put in there, 23rd, whatever it was, or 15th. And you could use a second paragraph or a second sentence about something else, maybe other people, whatever the people spoke about or something, but that's not even necessary either. Get in those 5 W's in paragraph 2, get the rest of them in there, pretty much. So like I said, the how and why, it's kind of implied a little bit in the name of the conference and so forth, so it should be fine. Okay, any questions? Okay, I think you should be ready for this. This should not be too hard. I've tried to give you some help here so you can get through this first one and feel more at ease. The second one, as I said, we'll start doing quizzes. If you give me your questions as part of your presentations, I will put them in a quiz, and that'll be your presentation or your participation grade. So, and you'll get a preview of what your next 6% quiz will be, because you'll be doing it every week. Be becoming familiar with those questions. Okay?
Can I pretend he also attended?
Yes. Yes, for everybody. Remember, Shirky can attend he's attending the conference. Yes, he's in a video, but he's, in our perspective, Shirky's attending the conference. Our Poe is attending the conference. Lowell is attending the conference. All of you are attending the conference. You can quote any of them. Any of those people are quotable in your story.